I'm Bill Hartung. I direct the Arms and Security Initiative here at the New America Foundation. We're here to talk about sort of the future of U.S. nuclear policy, how that affects what kind of nuclear weapons complex we need, what some alternatives would be, and also some security concerns about the current complex. We're going to start with Chris Payne, who directs the nuclear program at the Natural Resource Defense Council. He's formerly worked with Senator Edward Kennedy, who's a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. He is consultant to Princeton University's Project on Nuclear Policy Alternatives, research fellow at the Federation of American Scientists, a staff consultant for nuclear nonproliferation policy with the House Subcommittee on Energy, Conservation, and Power, and a co-founder of national campaigns to enact a nuclear weapons freeze and stop deployment of the MX missile, which is when I first met Chris, which was a few years ago. So I'm going to get out of the way, and Chris will do his presentation, and then we'll take it from there.
Thanks very much. I'm happy to be here. Don't be disturbed if I zip through some of these slides. This is a longer presentation than we have time for today, and so I'll be condensing it. Basically, the theme here is where we've been with U.S. nuclear weapons policy over the last 8 years, where we are today in the absence of any firm decisions, and where we should be going if we're seriously interested about moving towards a nuclear weapons-free world and containing nuclear proliferation. Well, where we've been for 8 years, it was really contained within the four corners of this document, the National Strategy to Combat Weapons of Mass Destruction. And for 8 years, our thinking on these questions were severely skewed by flawed postulates that underlay this document. The first one that I've identified in the Bush strategy that is still with us today is this notion that the possession and increased likelihood of use of weapons of mass destruction by hostile states and terrorists are realities of the current security environment. This is one of the premises of the Bush security doctrines. And I would just note that this consists of a triple conflation of threats, confusion and conflation of threats. Weapons of mass destruction concept in its essence glibly conflates chemical and bionuclear threats with nuclear threats. And hostile states in this formulation are conflated with terrorists. And of course, hostile states aren't remotely coterminous with terrorists. Increased likelihood of weapons of mass destruction use is conflated with reality of the current security environment. All of this was a self-fulfilling sort of crackpot realist approach masquerading as analysis. The biggest actual weapons of mass destruction threat then and now is the political economic disintegration of an unstable, friendly state, Pakistan. The second flawed postulate is derived from the first. We know from experience that we cannot always be successful in preventing and containing the proliferation of WMD to hostile states and terrorists. But actually, at the time those words were written, the only actual experience with WMD terrorism involved an Aum Shinrikyo cult's sarin gas attack in the Tokyo subway. We have since experienced a foil plot in the UK in 2003 to produce ricin, but terrorist experts believe that causing mass casualties with ricin is really not a feasible proposition. And now the third Bush postulate, today's threats are far more diverse and less predictable than those of the past. States hostile to the United States and to our friends and allies have demonstrated their willingness to take high risks to achieve their goals and are aggressively pursuing weapons of mass destruction and their means of delivery. As a consequence, we require new methods of deterrence. Well, you would think from this that non-proliferation had gone to hell in a handbasket, but actually that's not true. If we take a sort of reality check of where we were 30 years ago and where we are today, we've made a lot of headway on the nonproliferation problem. In 1979, there were 11 known countries of nuclear proliferation concern, and you can read them there. I won't enumerate them all. Today, there are 5, only one of which is a new entrant, North Korea. And there have been many other positive developments. South Africa, Argentina, Brazil, Taiwan, South Korea, Iraq, and Libya are off the proliferation list, all save Libya by the early 1990s. Algeria came and went as a proliferation threat in the period 1991-95, and after the fall of communism, we learned about the secret program that Romania had, which has since been disbanded. The NPT was indefinitely extended in 1995. Nuclear weapons have been removed from South Korea, all of Eastern Europe, and all the newly independent states of the former Soviet Union, save Russia. So, how did we force ourselves into a corner thinking that we were losing the battle against nonproliferation and that things are bleaker now than they were 30 years ago? I don't believe that's the case. An objective measure indicates that is not the case. There are more positive nuclear developments to note. Nuclear weapons-free zone treaties are in place in Latin America and Africa. The African zone came into effect in the mid-1990s. Chemical Weapons Convention entered into force into April 97, and we witnessed the termination of what we subsequently learned was a vast Soviet biowarfare program, and there are continuing efforts to strengthen verification of the Biological Weapons Convention. So the situation is not nearly as bleak as the Bush administration tried to persuade us it was. What are the genuine nuclear security concerns today that any realistic policy has to take account of? Clearly, the number one threat is that states with nuclear weapons can experience social, political upheavals and even societal breakdown. This scenario dominated our concerns in the 1990s with the messy implosion of Soviet-style state communism, and it dominates any realistic appraisal of threats today with the threatened disintegration of Pakistan with its nuclear arsenal. A second concern, and it's come to the fore with our disagreements with Iran, is that the NPT allows autonomous national acquisition of inherently dangerous nuclear fuel cycle capabilities under technically inadequate peaceful use safeguards. And finally, and this is something we've done a lot of work on at NRDC, a lot of technical work. The availability of highly enriched uranium stocks around the world that are directly usable in a simple improvised nuclear explosive device and that are stored in poorly secured locations is a very serious threat. And finally, we have an administration that has pledged to do something about it very directly and within 4 years. So again, these are the 3 serious concerns, not weapons of mass destruction being farmed out from some disgruntled rogue state to a terrorist group. Now, what was really at the heart of Team Bush's concerns, and has been at the heart of many hawkish concerns about U.S. Nuclear policy, is the fear that foreign weapons of mass destruction, any capability, chemical or biological, might be used as a tool of coercion against the United States, and particularly against the use of our conventional forces. And this was a big theme of the Bush team. And they imputed to others their own view that nuclear weapons were not weapons of last resort, and that other states viewed them, as indeed the Bush administration did, as tools of coercion and intimidation. And they worried that other states thought of nuclear weapons as militarily useful weapons of choice, intended to overcome our nation's advantages in conventional forces and possibly deter us from responding to aggression against our friends and allies in regions of vital interest. Now, how should the U.S. respond to this threat? The Bush administration had an answer. Make U.S. nuclear weapons militarily useful weapons of choice. And that's what the administration sought to do for 8 years. The United States will continue to make clear, this is the classified directive. It differs only in one word from the unclassified one, where the unclassified one said to the use would include resort to all of our options to the use of WMD against the United States. The classified version actually spelled it out and said, including potentially nuclear weapons. Now, clearly, the Bush's strategy did envision preemptive or coercive use of nuclear weapons by the United States, the very policies that they were projecting on other states. The Bush strategy authorized U.S. planning for nuclear first use against states with weapons of mass destruction. This, of course, that actually violated long-standing security assurances that previous administrations had offered to members in good standing of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, not necessarily of the other treaties, but to members in good standing of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, not to make them targets of nuclear attack. Bush plan pursued research and development of new nuclear weapons for global strike, is what they can, and this they viewed as a kind of continuum of capabilities ranging from advanced conventional weapons capabilities, to silo-busting conventional weapons, to low-yield nuclear weapons, to progressively higher-yield nuclear weapons that could deal with a full range of targets. And they spent tens, I would probably wager hundreds of billions of dollars. It's not really, we really don't know, on a panoply of systems designed to control the strategy of what they called full spectrum dominance of America's adversaries. All kinds of new capabilities, particularly in the command and control area, new satellite systems that would allow real-time conferencing between command authorities, the president, and intelligence on the ground, specifying which targets could be picked out in the middle of a conflict and struck with nuclear weapons. White House went so far, as we now know, because this was sort of the part of the same milieu that produced the torture imbroglio. The White House said that a preventive war strategy, if it involves preemptive attacks on biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons, would be legal. Now, at the same time, the administration didn't want to seem too fierce and said no cause justifies terror, and grievances, they admitted that there were grievances contributing to terrorism, but that such grievances had to be addressed within a political process. But then they turn around and you read the literature of that period, and America comes across as a pretty serious agent of terror. I mean, look at what Admiral Vern Clark said. The Navy's strategic vision is being about the most lethal, mean fighting machine that we know how to be. It's not about negotiating. They can try to negotiate all the solutions. It's good if they can. If they don't, what are we going to do? We're going to bring havoc and destruction. This is what, there's an audience for this kind of rhetoric, and it's countries like Iran that are not friendly to us, but aren't our enemies either. And they take these kinds of threats quite seriously, and it drives them in precisely the direction we don't want them to go, towards a nuclear deterrent. Now, the Bush administration developed a view of the overseas use of a country's ability to possibly deter our use of conventional forces was equal to blackmail, and that this blackmail had to be overcome or avoided in some way. This reminded me of a statement. This is a continuing theme in U.S. policy way back in 1982, where General John Vesey, an otherwise reasonable man, noted, we don't want a war, and we certainly don't want a nuclear war, but at the same time we don't want to be paralyzed by the fear of war as we pursue our economic, political, social, and cultural objectives. And this was in support of Reagan's request for a nuclear buildup. So recently, the theme of another theme running through the last 8 years and into the Schlesinger-Perry report of last week is the idea that the U.S. can strategically dissuade other countries from acquiring nuclear weapons or building up their forces by simply maintaining superiority. And that was a continuing theme that the United States had to maintain a nuclear program that was sufficiently robust and fierce to dissuade any country from hoping to compete with us. In the same document, no sooner had the administration enunciated that view that it turned around and within a few pages was lecturing China about how a military buildup on China's part would hamper its national greatness. And this is astonishing hypocrisy. You can't run an equitable international dialogue or debate on these issues from these kinds of premises. And that's why the Bush administration was basically the laughingstock of the world at the end. I'm going to skip all the details about nuclear strike planning during the Bush years, but it carried forward a tendency that developed during the Clinton years and made it a full-fledged secret program to develop nuclear targets in countries like North Korea, Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Libya. And current war planning does embrace nuclear options for attacking these countries. Most of them are actually members of the NPT, so that's a very corrosive development. And you know, almost all of the nuclear weapons initiatives proposed by the Bush administration were actually, fortunately, rejected by a Republican-controlled Congress. So that tells you something about where the center of gravity of American opinion is. It doesn't lie in continuing the nuclear arms race on the same old, tired, psychological premises. I mean, members of Congress have a sort of basic understanding of what's reasonable and what's not. And that saved us. In fact, a Republican leader of the House Appropriations Committee was absolutely key in turning back some of these initiatives. He played a bigger role than some of the leading Democrats. So this is not actually a partisan issue, even if my remarks sometimes sound partisan. There are sensible people on both sides of the aisle, and that's the hope for the future of nuclear policy. Here's one of the really unreasonable people, Senator Jim Sessions. And this gives you an idea of what the Obama administration will be up against in dealing with things like the ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban. I heard Jim Sessions at a meeting the other day trash the test ban and pledge that he would oppose it to his dying breath. But he basically here equates U.S. development of new nuclear weapons with its moral responsibility to lead the world and defend freedom. He even contemplates the use of nuclear weapons against Al-Qaeda. The idea that there's equal power for the arsenal of freedom is a bad idea. The idea that there might be ultimately some kind of global parity or stability between China, Russia, and the United States and other nuclear powers. He rejects that totally. The U.S. goal should be to be the first among equals. Senator Kyle advocated the use of nuclear weapons to get at the Iraqi leadership, but he regretted to say, he caveated that with, well, we didn't have the right nuclear weapons to use, but if we had them, we should have used them. Here's what happens when you actually use a nuclear weapon on a third world country like North Korea, a proliferant state. The idea that there are small nuclear weapons that can also strike at deeply buried targets is a technical fallacy. There are large nuclear weapons that can get you a few feet down, but it will always be possible to bury targets deeper than any morally rational use of nuclear weapons to get at them. So here we did a calculation with the HPAC code that showed that attacking this one command center in North Korea, and we had we had a satellite photograph of it, and we knew exactly where it's located. Produced 430 to 550,000 civilian casualties. So this is unacceptable. We just can't use nuclear weapons in this way. So nuclear weapons actually have a almost no role in deterring or dissuading proliferation, and we should just take that off the table. I will skip the plans for Bush's plans for the modernization of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, except to say that when Bush, early in the first administration, he increased the funding by about 25% over what it had been in the last year of the Clinton administration, and kept it, and it sort of stayed there. And eventually, inflation is catching up with the huge increases of the early Bush years. But we're spending still an enormous amount of money relative to the historical norm on our nuclear weapons research and development complex. Where are we now? We're somewhere between this negative Bush-Rumsfeld legacy and the reimposition of what was called the lead but hedge strategy of the 1990s. A kind of what I might call the sort of balanced center of the U.S. arms control debate. I also think after reading this Perry Schlesinger report, I would really characterize it as Bush light. It's most of the good things about the Bush nuclear posture, and he did a few good things with the Moscow Treaty and a significant 50% unilateral reduction in the active U.S. nuclear weapons stockpile. It's interesting that one of the most important and reasonable things that Bush did, he showed no interest to take credit for. They were almost ashamed of it because I think they were largely pushed into it by Congress. But they did actually make a very significant unilateral reduction in the U.S. nuclear stockpile without any compensating reductions that can be verified in the stocks of Russian nuclear warheads, which also is interesting, given that the hawkish position on nuclear weapons for decades was to insist on airtight verification. Doveri, no proveri was Reagan's maxim. Now, the Perry Schlesinger report, if any of you have read it, I commend it to you because it's a kind of catechism of the conventional wisdom. It's where the system will attempt to drive both Congress and Obama. In place of the Bush rationale that never really took hold, that nuclear weapons are needed to attack an imagined nexus of WMD-equipped rogue states and terrorists, Perry Schlesinger retreats to very familiar terrain, the need to maintain a deterrent sufficiently impressive and visible to provide assurance to the 30-odd nations that are protected under the U.S. nuclear umbrella. So this is the old reassure the allies. It's the allies that are keeping us in this nuclearized defense posture. And this is really extended deterrence is really the killer app for nuclear weapons. It's the one that Congress has the hardest time dealing with. It's politically sensitive. People tend to sort of genuflect and say, oh, we've got to maintain our alliances. If you can find 5 or 10 NATO ambassadors who will say privately that they want U.S. nuclear weapons to stay in Europe, then, by God, they've got to stay in Europe. Never mind that most of the European Parliament has called for the withdrawal of these weapons. Public opinion is overwhelmingly in favor of withdrawing them. But if they can locate some members of the cognoscenti and privately get them to tell senior American officials that nuclear weapons should stay, then you've solved this extended deterrence political problem and created a strong argument for keeping nuclear weapons. And that's what's going on right now. So from sort of cowboy unilateralism with respect to nuclear weapons, we're now back to very careful alliance diplomacy. Do I feel safe already? Maybe a little bit safer, but what has really changed? Not much. The rhetoric is changing dramatically, and the rhetorical justifications are changing dramatically. But this report actually provides very little support to Obama's notion that he wants to move towards a nuclear weapons-free world. It basically says the goal is impractical for the indefinite future. That's a pretty powerful phrase, for the indefinite future. Now, Schlesinger told Congress the other day, we should all bear in mind that abolition of nuclear weapons will not occur outside the transformation of world politics. And I think this is a really dim-witted observation. It's like saying we cannot decarbonize the global energy supply until someone discovers a limitless supply of cost-effective, clean energy. And we're just going to wait for the day that happens. Someday, someone will transform world politics, and we can take another look at nuclear weapons. But of course, the multiple, if imperfect, attempts to reduce carbon emissions are the surest route to uncovering truly transformative clean energy paths, and the same logic applies to nuclear weapons. The threat they pose to the future of humanity is also sufficiently grave, like climate change, that the collective recognition of the need to begin the task of their eventual elimination will itself be a continuing source of partial transformations. We're not going to get there in one gigantic transformation, but these partial transformations can move us ever closer to the abolition goal. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to say a few words. As I said, I'm Bill Hartung, and I run the Arms and Security Initiative here at the New America Foundation. Chris has given us some food for thought about the extent to which we're really on the path to eliminating nuclear weapons. The administration has said a lot of the right things. They've talked about eliminating nuclear weapons. They've talked about pursuing a test ban treaty. They've talked about a treaty to eliminate the production of fissile materials, the materials you would use to make a nuclear bomb. They've talked about securing nuclear warheads and loose nuclear materials within 4 years. They've talked about significant reductions with Russia. So it's my hope that they will make progress along each of these lines. But I think Chris makes a point that it's got to be based on a new conceptual framework, not things like extended deterrence and wait until the allies come along and so forth. But if you take the administration at their word, you have to question, if you're trying to eliminate nuclear weapons, why on earth would you be upgrading the complex that does research, design, and production of nuclear weapons? And that's the situation we find ourselves in at the moment. This is a bad idea, not only because it contradicts the administration's goal for sharp reductions in nuclear weapons, but it sends the wrong signal to our allies, and it provides political cover for countries like Iran and North Korea, where they can say, well, if the United States is building up their nuclear weapons production capabilities, why should we get rid of ours? And so it therefore complicates efforts to get other countries to eliminate their nuclear weapons or put aside whatever nuclear weapons aspirations they may have. This is rooted, this plan to build new nuclear weapons facilities, to invest in the long term, perhaps as much as $175 billion to sustain this complex over the next 2 decades, is rooted in part in the book Bush Nuclear Posture, which talks about a responsive nuclear infrastructure, which means, well, whether we want to produce fewer, whether we want to produce more, we need flexibility. Flexibility is a concept that really means you don't have to ever reduce your nuclear weapons complex because you have to be ready for anything. So it doesn't really fit with the concept of pushing for reductions. As part of this posture review, in the usual kind of antiseptic language of the bureaucracy, they came up with a plan called complex transformation, You could call it the plan to be able to build bombs forever, but I don't think that would get quite the same reception. Now, one of the things about this plan is that they started with 8 nuclear weapons facilities and sites, and they ended with 8 nuclear weapons sites. So not exactly a consolidation. And among the facilities, this is certainly doesn't exhaust the list, but included a new uranium processing facility in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a new facility to build plutonium pits, the triggers of a nuclear weapon in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and a plan to build a new facility to build the non-nuclear parts of a nuclear weapon in Kansas City, Missouri. Now, these facilities are in the budget this year, and there's projections over 5 years to spend a little over $1 billion on them. To build them all would cost at least $6 billion, probably considerably more. I guess there's a little bit of body language by the Obama administration in the sense that they've reduced spending on these elements. They've talked about going into a holding pattern as to whether to go forward until they finish their nuclear posture review. But I think the real question is, why is the money there at all? If we really want to send a signal to the world that we're going to get out of the nuclear weapons business, we shouldn't be building new nuclear weapons factories. There's a couple examples of what we're up against and what we should be doing. Thomas D'Agostino, who is the director of the National Nuclear Security Administration, which runs the bomb complex, said in recent congressional testimony that facilities like the uranium processing facility would be needed, quote, whether we have a stockpile of 0 weapons or a stockpile of thousands of weapons. So their position is we're going to build it come hell or high water. And they're no doubt going to try to convince the administration to do that regardless of what their nuclear posture review comes up with. On the other hand, Phil Coyle, who worked in one form or another in the nuclear complex for over 30 years, has said now that Obama has made a decision to halt the reliable replacement warhead, another one of those antiseptic pieces of rhetoric, the production workload for the complex can be cut in half. And I think it probably could go beyond that. Everett Beckner, who used to run the nuclear weapons complex, even he is saying we should hold off on the uranium processing facility, on the pit production facility, and we may not need the Kansas City plant at all. So when you have the former director of this complex saying we don't need this stuff, you can see how far out of whack with reality the current leadership is. Now there's a question of what this may cost, and I think that depends on a couple issues. As I said, were they to stick with the current NNSA plans, we could be investing $175 billion over the next 20 years. And even initial new investment over a 5-year period could be at least $7 billion just for the pit production and uranium processing facilities. Now that doesn't square with the current Obama budget, which, as I said, for these facilities alone, about $1 billion over 5 years. But I think the idea of the bureaucracy is let's hang in there, let's keep these things funded, and then we can make our case later and ramp things back up again in accord with the plan that we've already developed, which, as was mentioned, was developed to support the aggressive nuclear policy of the Bush administration. Now, there's plenty of other things that money could be used for. If you look at the International Atomic Energy Agency, until recently, their entire budget was less than $400 million a year. That would be a much better investment of funds to support that effort than to put it into new nuclear weapons facilities. And then finally, the question that's always asked is, well, it's fine to criticize, but what is your alternative? And thankfully, that was not left up to me. But there is a report which is available today done by colleagues called Transforming the U.S. Strategic Posture and Weapons Complex for Transition to a Nuclear Weapons-Free World. It was a coalition effort. It included contributions from NRDC and the Project on Government Oversight, both of whom have representatives here today. And the thrust of it, and I'll quote from the report, we recommend a more conservative approach to maintaining the existing nuclear weapons stockpile, based on ensuring that today's safe and secure warheads are changed as little as possible, only in response to documented findings that corrective action is needed. The key to this approach is the finding that there is no need for the United States to design any new nuclear weapons or to make major changes in existing ones. And in keeping with this philosophy, this approach would reduce the number of production sites involved in the nuclear weapons enterprise from 8 to 3. So it would be a genuine consolidation. And the idea is that it would be a first step, that as we move down to 500 warheads and then below, you would shrink the complex at the same time that you are shrinking the arsenal. This would save over $2 billion the first year of implementation, and it could cut the cost of the whole complex, which, as Chris's slides indicated, is about $6.4 or so billion a year. That would be cut by about 2/3. So to close, I would just say upgrading the weapons complex sends exactly the wrong message because it contradicts any notion that we're going to go to zero on nuclear weapons, that we're going to sharply reduce them. And I think for that reason alone, it should be defunded. There's also the issue of economic costs, which I think is secondary but also important. So I'll leave it at that. Our report is available to folks here and also is posted online. And so as soon as I find her bio, I will introduce the next speaker. We're going to hear from Ingrid Drake, who's an investigator at the Project on Government Oversight, better known as POGO, and who since joining POGO in 2007 has worked on investigations examining the security of the Department of Energy's weapons-grade quantities of plutonium and highly enriched uranium, including a resulting report called U.S. Nuclear Weapons Complex, Livermore Homes and Plutonium Make Bad Neighbors. Ingrid came to POGO after years working as a print and radio journalist, and she's going to talk about security issues with the complex. And if we're going to invest time and energy in the complex, it makes much more sense to look at improving security than it does in building new bomb facilities. So I'll turn it over to Ingrid.
Thank you. POGO wrote our first report on nuclear security in 2001, and since then we've done 5 separate reports. We are invited to the Department of Energy every few months to talk to them about our findings. One of those reasons is because I work closely with a man named Peter Stockton, who used to be at the Department of Energy as a security advisor, and he was somewhat of a reformer there and was not afraid to say what he saw. And I think that attracted the attention of those within the Department of Energy and throughout the weapons complex who also thought that there were major reforms that needed to happen. And many of those who were very concerned about the security of our labs. So Peter left the Department of Energy several years ago, and many of those within the department have still been expressing to him and to POGO their concerns. So a lot of our findings are based on inside perspectives from the labs, many of them security officers from the labs, as well as some bureaucrats, some of those who are in Washington or throughout the complex who really take security very seriously. So that's where we're coming from. We're really trying to be a voice for those who see a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse at the weapons complex. Our general concern about the complex is that there's still too much special nuclear material. There are still too many sites to guard, and there are too many targets at each site. And that results in too much spending on security as well as too much insecurity for those of us who live near the complex or in big cities. The reason is there is significant risk with the complex as it stands. The risk number one is that if material was stolen from one of the labs, it could easily be created in an improvised nuclear device. This only takes minutes to accomplish. Our second concern or second risk is that a radiological dispersal device could be created on site of a lab. And third is material could, of course, be stolen and sold or taken to a highly populated U.S. city. Many within the Department of Energy realize that the complex is too big and full of too much stuff. And that is why consolidation of the complex has been an idea that has had a lot of force for at least 10 years. In 2001, the Scowcroft Commission came up with a classified report that suggested a dramatically consolidated complex. And in 2005, the Secretary of Energy also had an advisory board who recommended a much more dramatic consolidation. Neither of those recommendations were taken seriously. When the public hears about poorly secured nuclear facilities, they often picture Russia or the former Soviet states. And one of the things that POGO has done over the years is to illustrate that our own complex is insecure. And I'm going to share a few examples of recent events. And also just to note that Russia, in some ways, has actually done a better job than the United States with securing their fissile material, downblending much more highly enriched uranium than we have, and that remains a concern of ours. In just of this year, in January, the Department of Energy had inspectors who found that the amounts of nuclear material that the Los Alamos National Laboratory could not account for, quote, exceeded alarm limits. That means that they didn't know where plutonium was located. And while Los Alamos said there was no suspicion of theft or diversion of this material, we said, if you cannot account for the material, how do you know? And what could have happened is somebody, an inside threat, could be slowly taking material and finding a way to remove it from the facility. For example, propping open a fire door from one of the facilities where they are storing the material, and using a lacrosse stick to throw the material over the fence line. And we didn't come up with this out of thin air, but this is a scenario that was devised by the special forces who test the nuclear facilities as a reasonable possibility of adversaries attacking a facility. Also, last year, this is maybe a highly publicized event you all might have heard of, but the Lawrence Livermore Nuclear Laboratory, which is surrounded by a suburban population, the facility failed 2 out of 3 of the scenarios that they were tested on security. It was proven that armed adversaries working as a team could steal plutonium and highly enriched uranium, and they had enough time to assemble an improvised nuclear device on site. And this is an interesting example because the site is surrounded by a highly residential area and has been very difficult to defend because there is the population has built itself right up to the fence line of the facility. And the facility, of course, can't expand and create longer timelines from someone entering to where the facility is, that they've employed the use of a Gatling gun. And this is a new technology that the department has promised, can really be the final force. And this technology broke down in the event of their test. It did not work, and so we are not convinced that technology holds the answer. Also last year at the Y-12 site in Tennessee, and this is the site that houses our nation's repository of highly enriched uranium. We believe there's more than 200 metric tons, almost 300 metric tons right now, that is being stored in World War II era facilities. At this site, armed guards came close to shooting their peers during a mock attack when the communication system broke down. that raises another concern that we have about the complex. Currently, the Guard force is not a federalized force. They're not federal employees, they're contract employees. And this raises a number of issues that affects the complex. The benefits that the Guard force will receive now are not enough that someone may decide to put their life on the line. They don't have the assurances that their family would be taken care of in the event of a disastrous attack. They are also limited in what actions that they can take at the facilities because they're not federal agents. And there's currently a kind of a roadblock at the Department of Energy right now from going forward with what's called federalization, even though there seems to be quite a bit of support and just common sense support why this needs to happen, and that most of the public doesn't know that our nuclear laboratories are guarded by private forces. What's new? The Commission on the Strategic Posture, in our opinion, did not take seriously the risk or the weaknesses of the complex, and it's a great concern. What else is new is that the Department of Energy has changed how they are measuring the security prowess of each of the laboratories. In the past, it's been something called the design basis threat, which is formulated by intelligence and security experts on what type of force or how many people may attack a facility, what kind of weapons they may use. And this has been somewhat standard, so that all of the facilities who are storing plutonium and highly enriched uranium in the United States have to guard against this force. Over the last few years, many of them actually could not afford to or did not invest in the Guard forces to actually be able to defend against those the design basis threat, and many were given waivers. And that became somewhat of an embarrassment for the Department of Energy. And they have actually changed the name of the design basis threat and call it the Graded Security Protection Plan, the GSP, which we are concerned about because no longer is there one level of protection that each of the sites need to guard against, but each site has a different kind of policy that they have to guard against, and we don't think this makes any sense if each of the facilities actually are protecting the same thing. They all have special nuclear material. Just because you are in a valley and it's harder to protect yourself shouldn't mean that your criteria should be lower. We would say that, in fact, you should no longer be holding special nuclear material at a facility that cannot be guarded. And I'll move on to our recommendations. Our recommendation that we feel like we can actually see this resolved in the coming months is the downblending of between 200 and 300 metric tons of highly enriched uranium that's excess to defense needs that's actually just being stored right now. And this is a possibility because there's it's an extremely valuable resource, downblended highly enriched uranium. You can create low enriched uranium, LEU, which can be used to power nuclear power plants as a fuel. And so we're asking for this for a timeline to be set and for the wheels to be put in motion, including appropriations for the downblending of highly enriched uranium. And we would also recommend, and this is contained in our report, that 92 metric tons of plutonium be designated as surplus and be integrated into an immobilization program. And final two recommendations, we believe the nuclear weapons sites, Los Alamos, Livermore, should be actually tested by something called the Grizzly Hitch, which are a force of who are trained as terrorists, as opposed to DOE's current adversary trained force, who are trained as a defensive guard force. So there's a different mindset there, and that's something we've been recommending for years. And finally, we believe DOE should federalize its guard force. And that's it. Take questions.
Thank you all. And we have about 25 minutes for questions. We have to get out promptly at 10:30 because there's an event coming in after this. So hopefully we can get a decent amount of our discussion in. And, this is not the be-all and end-all. There'll be ways to have dialogue after this event. Yes?
My name is Dmitry. I unfortunately represent myself. So what I need to say, it's very important issue of this discussion, but without alternative, it's construct bridge to nowhere. We need to have alternative, and such alternative fortunately exists. I don't want to spend your time, but if you send me email denovik@verizon.net, I will send you material with details of this alternative. I need.
Do you have a question for one of the?
I'm sorry, it's not your role.
No, it is.
Well, no.
That's exactly.
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
it actually is his
I'm
role.
sorry.
We're working together.
I'm
so-
sorry.
If you have a
Okay.
question, just ask me a question.
Please, give me possibility to speak. I need to say that we need to use analog. So small countries can design avialiner. So to design atomic bomb is huge problem for any country. And it's only two ways to do this. One way, share the knowledge and all the stuff to another country as Soviet Union
Now,
did with China.
It doesn't seem like you're leading towards a question. If you have a question,
Question, what is your alternative?
Alternative to nuclear deterrence? I'm sorry, Earl.
Yes.
We lay that out in our report, what we think ultimately can be a transition away from nuclear weapons. And it involves, frequently this issue is addressed as, and the Perry-Schlesinger Commission addressed it this way, the choice is between nuclear abolition or continuing with the status quo. And it's easy to lampoon the notion that anytime soon we're going to completely abolish nuclear weapons. Therefore, we're simply stuck with what we have, which is a proliferated world and lots of nuclear weapons. And I submit that there are many alternatives between those two extremes. And the one that we are attracted to is for countries, nuclear countries, to begin stripping away systematically all the missions for nuclear weapons that are not irreducible. And there's only one mission that's not irreducible, and that's to deter the use of nuclear weapons by others as long as nuclear weapons exist. So if all nuclear countries can unilaterally bring themselves to the determination that the only reason they retain nuclear weapons is to deter their use by others, that logically opens the possibility of actually getting rid of the weapons when other countries agree to do likewise. And so then the emphasis becomes, how do you reach that? How do you reach that stage of agreement? The problem today is that the United States has maybe a dozen reasons why it keeps nuclear weapons, all of which are independent of this postulate of deterring the others' use of nuclear weapons. They represent autonomous, freestanding reasons that would persist even if other countries got rid of their nuclear weapons. So that's the first step. is a conceptual and a psychological shift in how we think about nuclear weapons, and systematically stripping away missions such as extended deterrence, defending Japan with the threat to start nuclear war, defending Germany with a threat to start nuclear war, letting these countries stand on their own 2 feet defense-wise with some help from our conventional military alliance, and trying to build a multipolar world with a more rules-based structure. And if one heads in that direction, one can envision a transition where nuclear weapons still exist, but countries have voluntarily ceded the right to their active employment in world politics to the Security Council. So we would maintain nuclear weapons in storage. China would maintain nuclear weapons in storage. Russia would as well. But we would not deploy them unless the Security Council made a determination that there was an imminent threat to security that merited the deployment of nuclear weapons. Otherwise, they would stay in their storages. And over time, the world would learn to live without nuclear deterrence. And one could either shift the deterrent role entirely to the United Nations, or move to physical elimination of all the remaining weapons.
Well, that sounds to me like a decently articulated beginnings of an alternative. Are there other questions? Yes.
Thanks. I'm Colin McCormick. I work at the Federation of American Scientists with Hans Christensen and Ivan Ulrich. So you're obviously aware there's a proposal floating around to move the weapons complex into the hands of the Defense Department. This is something the administration's been discussing. Some people on the Hill have been vehemently against it. And there's many issues to think through on that proposal, and I don't want to endorse it or get into too many of those issues. But I wonder if you could talk to the complex security question of how a potential move of the complex to the authority of the Defense Department would affect security of the complex. If you think that would be a preferable alternative, or if a federalized force under DOE would be just as good as a Defense Department military protection force.
Great. Ingrid?
Our position on that shift has been to be opposed on the basis that you would lose the oversight function that currently exists, and that we do not have the confidence that the other committees would have the knowledge of the complex, and that it wouldn't really get lost in all of the other projects that they would need to oversee. So,
yeah, I would say that I would think the military probably, if those were military sites, that professional military guard forces could probably do a better job. This is not it's a better job than is currently being done now. But what you give up is that there's a certain level of transparency to the whole nuclear weapons enterprise that derives from the original Atomic Energy Act and its presence, the control over nuclear warhead design and development by a civilian agency. And historically, I think that's been very important. It's kind of why our nuclear enterprise at the end of the day didn't resemble Russia's. And so I think that tradition of civilian control and some measure of transparency and even academic or intellectual accountability, because the labs have been managed by the University of California and now are only partially managed by the University of California, there has been some attempts, not as much as one would like, at peer review and intellectual honesty and transparency in thinking about nuclear weapons and the design of nuclear weapons and so forth. And all of that would disappear under the military's culture of secrecy. And I just don't think I'm willing to pay even a little bit of a price in terms of security to retain that, because I think that's also an important value, that the lack of which can also get us into trouble.
Well, no, there's other people with questions. We want to give everybody a chance. Yes.
David Fishman, independent consultant. Question for probably for Chris Payne and William Harding. In the presentation, you mentioned the nature of other countries, the situation in other countries as being an important part of the picture. In other words, instability or the nature of the U.S. relationship with China, with Russia, with Pakistan. China, the U.S.-Chinese relationship is fairly stable these days. Russia, it's in the process of being reset, which is complicated. And Pakistan is in the headlines these days with tremendous uncertainty and confusion. And the report comments that there's almost no connection between modernizing our facilities in Oak Ridge and Kansas City and what might happen in Pakistan. I mean, the logic of that is there's absolutely no deterrence connection whatsoever in that kind of a context. What I'm wondering is how much effort are you devoting to the relationship issues of the U.S.-China relationship, the U.S.-Russia relationship, and the U.S.-Pakistan, I'd call it an interface at this point? Because it would seem to me that those are an important part of the picture, which not, comparatively speaking, not very much being done.
Well, NRDC wrote a book with FAS 2 years ago on the emerging strategic competition with China, and we basically tried to, with sort of painstaking work, tried to puncture the growing tendency within the Bush administration to project a future strategic competition with China as inevitable, and that the United States had to prepare both in terms of its nuclear posture and its conventional posture for the rise of China. And we take a different view. And here I think Bill Perry's on very solid ground. It's one of the recommendations that I do like of the Commission's report, that we need to start a dialogue with China that encompasses nuclear weapons and a lot of other things besides. That's a broad strategic dialogue about how the countries can avoid fruitless military competition and really go at one of the original rationales, directly at one of the original rationales for arms control, which is to avoid unnecessary and stupid, wasteful expenditures on the part of both countries. And with an intelligently designed dialogue and possibly some formal agreements with China, we can do that.
How about Russia?
We've been concerned about Pakistan. I became concerned about Pakistan when I worked in the Senate in the 1990s, and when we decertified the country because of its nuclear weapons program. And at the same time, we were funding right-wing Pakistani militant groups to fight in Afghanistan. And I always thought that nexus was very, very problematic, as it's turned out to be. Russia is, obviously we're going to make some considerable headway here in resetting our relations with Russia. I think it's already happening. I think the Bush administration kind of ignored that other component of our policy, which is very active in the 90s, but has just faded away totally, which is, what about civil society in Russia? What about our democracy goals? What about forging a partner for the long term that will enable us to, basically get rid of the nuclear arms competition with Russia? In order to have the confidence to do that, to have a relationship with Russia like we have with France or the United Kingdom, it's going to require political changes in Russia. It's not something that can happen just by fiat or by act of will on the part of the United States or an act of realpolitik. And so, because otherwise our nuclear initiatives are always subject to being whipsawed, as they have been in the past, by some internal political outrage or some Russian heavy-handed, ham-fisted intervention in another country. So, we have to have that kind of broad strategic dialogue with Russia and hope to nurture over time, as we reduce our nuclear weapons, the kind of political changes in Russia that will make it more amenable, for our political traditions.
With respect to Pakistan, my project directly has not engaged that. I think you're right. The political relationships at this point are probably more important than the technical issues of numbers of weapons. There's been, ideally a secular, stable Pakistan would be far less dangerous than a Pakistan that's falling apart in the midst of fighting the Taliban and Al Qaeda remnants. But how to get there, I haven't heard any, sort of silver bullet plan. I do think people like Michael Crapon and others have talked about how to deal with security of the Pakistani weapons, making sure they have ways to keep them from being captured and used by terrorist groups. And I think communication on that front would be a good kind of parallel path to look at. But I commend to you, there's a panel later today here on Pakistan, which will talk about sort of some of the on-the-ground realities there. But I think that's a question for us all to wrestle with, that I don't think we've come up with any, smart or kind of controlling answers.
The United States does have a classified program to help secure the Pakistani nuclear weapon sites, but we don't have direct access. We give the equipment and technology to the Pakistani military, and they don't actually let us inspect what's been accomplished or not been accomplished. So we don't really know how that $100 million has been spent and how effective it's been. We do know that, at least this is what our sources tell us, that the Pakistani nuclear weapon design is a removable core, so that the fissile cores can be stored separately from the implosion systems, which is both good and bad. I mean, if someone steals an empty implosion system, it's not as serious as actually stealing an intact weapon. But on the other hand, the material is highly enriched uranium, and if it's existing as highly enriched uranium metal in some storage site somewhere, that in itself is a highly sensitive object, and in and of itself represents a threat, a very serious threat.
Yes, you had a question here.
Yes, my name is Ursula Gelis from Germany, from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. My question is, what is the current reading on the militarization of space program in the Obama administration?
I don't have a good feel for that. They've made some very small steps towards reining in the missile defense program. I mean, $1.4 billion out of a $10 billion program obviously is a relatively small step. They're talking about canceling the airborne laser system. I think some of these other elements have been under research. I don't know how far along they've gotten on those, and I don't know how much thought the administration's given to that. So I don't know if Chris has further points on that. But
well, just that after spending $10 billion a year, and if you include the intelligence and surveillance elements of missile defense, it's even more money. They actually have made some progress, technical progress on the sensors, and especially the space-based infrared system high. The performance of that sensor really seems to be quite extraordinary from what little we've seen in the aerospace press about it. So when that happens, there's kind of the system kind of coalesces around, sweet technology. Always is its own best advocate, and it's very tough if a program is succeeding technically to kill it on principled grounds. So I don't expect that the whole question of the military uses or militarization of space is going to disappear under the Obama administration. It's going to be a live issue. They aren't, in other words, they aren't the magic bullet to solve that particular problem. They're just more sympathetic people in high places to sort of willing to examine arms control possibilities, at least, than in the previous administration.
Yes, you've had your hand up for a while. And we're getting close to the 10:30 witching hour. So if keep the questions pointed, we might get another one in.
Okay. One comment for Chris is that you mentioned the Aum attack in 1995, and I was there in Tokyo, and that was hardly a weapons of mass destruction. It was just emulsified sarin gas in plastic bags that they poked a hole with nails. and the station guy who mopped it up later died, and another 5,000 people, because these were crowded subway trains, got injured. Question to Ingrid is, you followed up on the upstream materials, nuclear, whether plutonium or uranium, but what about who's following on what happens to all the weapons that U.S. has in the field, whether it's Air Force that doesn't quite account for what happens to their bombs, all the things in the aircraft carriers and the submarines. Those are the real threats of mistakes, I think. And does POGO not follow that?
Not so much. I can. Yeah, we haven't made it. We haven't codified any recommendations after what the Air Force, what happened at the Air Force. So no, I actually don't have a comment. Christopher does.
I think that what happened with the Air Force at the mine at Barksdale flight, and then again at the Logan Supply Depot in Utah, is symptomatic of the problem of not having a direction, a really defined direction for the future of the nuclear enterprise. It's just sort of been floating out there. The numbers have been slowly coming down, but there's been no real architecture or plan, and so the people engaged in this, it's become kind of a backwater. And the response to those episodes was, my God, the solution is to reinvigorate the enterprise. The reason it happened is because we're not paying enough attention, and the reason we're not paying enough attention is we don't care enough about these weapons, so let's care more about the weapons, let's care more about nuclear deterrence. And that was essentially the message of Jim Schlesinger and other conservatives on this panel, is we've got to care more about the weapons so we can avoid episodes. Well, of course, the other way of avoiding episodes is to scale down the nuclear enterprise to a much more manageable size and a much simpler set of requirements. For example, basically don't deploy nearly as many weapons, have much smaller inventories to manage, have much simpler paradigms for what needs to be maintained, and so forth. So part of the problem arises that there's been no real executive level guidance on a kind of a transitional or interim stage for nuclear deterrence, somewhere between where we are now and getting rid of nuclear weapons. And that stage, we ought to be prepared for that stage to last quite a long time, because those final steps are going to be quite difficult. But we're just now starting to think of, maybe the way to resolve this problem is not to build back up or to reinvigorate nuclear deterrence, but basically to scale it down until it's a more manageable problem.
Well, this will be the final question, so if you'd like to.
How would you respond to what I think is the inevitable criticism of this is an example of the left wing being naive and what will be attempts to portray this as part of the larger picture of us being weak on national security and weak on defense matters that has been pushed for so many years?
Well, I would say we need to be smart on national defense, and I think there's no legitimate use for nuclear weapons. They have no real military utility other than to cause catastrophic casualties. So in that sense, if you're concerned about national defense, I think you need a new concept. If there's other areas of importance, perhaps we invest there instead of in the nuclear enterprise. Chris, do you have other thoughts?
I think a really hard-nosed realist appraisal of where the world is likely to go, unless if we don't get on a very significant nuclear reductions track, would lead you to think that the proponents of nuclear deterrence, or at least the status quo, are the people smoking the dope. They're the pipe dream. They haven't grasped that we're at a turning point, that expectations have been raised, patience is wearing thin in a number of countries, and that there are huge numbers of countries out there, including some of our closest allies, who could make the determination to go nuclear if they don't see an alternative security paradigm emerging. At some point, they're just going to, they've waited, 40 years, for the NPT promise to be fulfilled. It hasn't been fulfilled. They're getting a little antsy. They're watching countries like Iran, and there's an erosion taking place. It's kind of subtle, people don't realize that, Brazil, for example, is not in full compliance with its safeguards agreement. It won't let the IAEA into a certain part of its enrichment plant that makes fuel for its navy. And the reason that that's happening is because Brazil is hedging its bets. It doesn't really believe that the United States and other countries are seriously committed to a nuclear weapons-free world, and so they have to sort of hang back and say, well, maybe it's not going to be a nuclear weapons-free world. Maybe it'll be a nuclear world with a multilateral, heavily nuclearized world. So I think the realistic, hard-edged point of view on this is we have to get serious now. We are in sort of a transitional period where we have to get serious about nonproliferation and try to make it work. And the way to make it work is to set forth a series of steps that other countries can actually believe will improve their security from nuclear threats. And that to me is the realistic approach. Just sort of leaning back and saying we're going to go back to sort of a NATO-style nuclear alliance politics circa the mid-'70s, which is sort of where the Schlesinger-Perry Commission comes out. To me, that's not realistic. And they'll find out. They'll find out at the NPT review next year how unrealistic that is. And they'll find out watching the Iranians be incredibly recalcitrant. And the Iranians will get support from other countries.
So sadly, I think that wraps up our available time, at least in this room. If you want to buttonhole one of us in the hallway, I think that might be possible, at least briefly. And thank everybody for coming. Appreciate it.